Good morning, buenos dias. How are you guys? Like every Tuesday, we're here with our live Gerardo Macias, El Headhunter with Stavridge in Monterrey, Mexico. And today we have Brian Robertson. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Great meeting you. And well, today we have a very interesting topic. But first of all, Brian, tell us a little bit more about who you are as a person.
Yeah, well, I'm the founder of Holacracy, which is what usually gets me on interviews like this.
Right.
But I also live in Austin, Texas, in the U.S. I love it here. And yeah, I'm more than just Holacracy, I like to think. But I do love my work.
Perfect. Great to hear that. And what is your purpose in life?
Yeah, my personal purpose I capture as I show people a radical new way to organize power. And obviously, holacracy is one expression of that, but it goes beyond that. I'm fascinated by how we humans show up in relationship to each other and how we do that in a way that maintains our own sense of empowered autonomy and yet in interconnection in ways that we get to interrelate in ways that leave others space to be empowered as well with us and to be in a deep, loving connection, even as we're in a powerful, autonomous connection. And so my purpose in life is to find and show people new ways of being more powerful and more connected.
Awesome. I like that. And now, Brian, how did you come up with Holacracy One, what you're doing? I mean, because I understand you were in the corporate world for a while. So tell us a little bit more about your development as a professional and how you got here.
Yeah, so my background's in software development. I started coding when I was still a child, actually, very young, and ended up joining the working world as a software developer initially. And, you know, I was really dissatisfied with the companies I worked in. I realized very early on that it wasn't the technical challenges that were the biggest obstacles to building great software. It was the human systems around us. It was the management systems. It was almost like the companies I worked in seemed like they were built to resist change. They were built to stop innovation and stop creativity. And so I got really curious. How do I build a company that embraces that? How do I build a company where people can drive change? And I didn't know how to do it, but that's kind of what drove me to be an entrepreneur. So I started my first software company about 20 years ago, and I started it just to be a laboratory, to be a place to experiment. I wanted to find new ways to organize, new ways to embrace people's creativity and innovation and autonomy. And for years, in that company, we just tried any method, technique, process, anything we could think of. And Holacracy kind of grew out of that. It grew out of that background and experimentation in a real business.
Okay. And why the term Holacracy? What does it mean? Where does it come from? I mean, we have a translation in Spanish, which is Holacracia. Many of our HR colleagues know about it, but why the name for the company or the term? You know, what's the origin of?
Yeah, so the root word is holarchy, which is a specific type of structure. We didn't make up that word. It's been around for a while, but it describes the kind of structure where there are layers and every layer is autonomous and yet part of a larger system. So my favorite example of a holarchy is the human body, right? Every cell has autonomy. Every cell is self-organizing. There's no other cell that reaches in and structures the cell, right? It kind of has its own autonomous self-organizing system. And yet it's also part of an organ, right? And the organ doesn't violate the autonomy of the cells. It's not micromanaging the cells. It's building on top of them a larger autonomous function, which is part of yet a larger system. And that structure is called a holarchy, autonomy at every level, and yet integration and alignment with a larger entity. And the root of holacracy is holarchy because that's the kind of structure it brings into an organization where every layer, every role, every team has autonomy and self-organizes, and yet is part of a larger system that it needs to align with.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, to tell the truth, I heard about the term, but I wasn't that related to the actual meaning of it, which I think is amazing, especially for Latin American companies. We have a tendency to micromanage employees all the time. I mean, that's part of our culture, I guess. Things are evolving in Mexico, in other countries. I mean, we work with clients in Colombia, for example, which is much more advanced in terms of culture. But with this, how has been your experience overall with companies in Latin America, in the US, and where do you find a more open culture from owners or CEOs, to better their organization?
Yeah. So I think there's almost an evolution of management that you can find, and different cultures are at different places just based on when they kind of matured their own management thinking. And earlier on that, I mean, at the extreme early end there's very little management. It's just pretty much people just bossing around, doing whatever makes sense to them. And then you get into the more hierarchical micromanaging, kind of where the bosses are taking responsibility for the team, but they're getting there by just bossing people around, micromanaging them. And that's not very effective leadership. I think most people now realize this, even if they kind of still do it sometimes. It's hard to get out of it. But what you really want, even in a management hierarchy, is a boss who creates clarity to empower, right? Not a boss that just tells people what to do. That's not very scalable. It's not very effective. But a boss that tells people, here's what you're responsible for. Here are the boundaries you need to honor. Now you go lead within those goals, and within these boundaries, you lead your piece. I'm not going to micromanage it. And here's when you need to talk to me, right? So that's kind of a more mature management stance. And then I think self-management, or something like what Holacracy does, is actually further maturing that up. It's not opposed to what we want in a management hierarchy at all. It's a natural extension of management until you get to a point where you realize, wait a minute, if the boss, quote, does the work really, really well of creating clarity, you don't need a boss anymore. And in fact, it works better to invite everyone to be part of that clarifying process, as long as you have some kind of meta process or some way of inviting everyone to be part of clarifying, what do we need to expect from each other? What are the goals? What are the boundaries? Right? And that's really what Holacracy is. It's a framework for doing that. So in that sense, I think it's helping mature management. It's often thought of as anti-management because there are no managers, there are no bosses. But I think that's actually missing the point. I think it's a maturing up of management to a point where it's so good that you can invite everyone to do it, and you don't need just a micromanaging boss anymore. You have really good management.
I see. Now, and what about your experience with clients in the US, other countries? Yeah. Where do you find, again, a more open culture to adapt to better themselves? Yeah. Talking about CEOs, but also about others. Others and the whole company culture, I guess.
Yeah. So far, what I've seen, the part of the world that seems to be most likely is actually most of the European countries. And more so than the US even, there's almost more, I don't know, I imagine there's more awareness in Europe that you have to integrate different people and different perspectives. And Europe's lived through enough of a history of failing to do that there's almost more awareness. So they seem to be a little ahead of the US in general in their management thinking. It's interesting though, even within Europe, I'm surprised how much movement there is, even in relatively old traditional cultures. Like France there has a lot of movement. And I asked one of my colleagues there, why? France is such a traditional hierarchical culture. It's a Latin culture too, and he said, I think we just suffer more from the limits of it. So we've had to kind of jump ahead to just survive. And I'm seeing the same thing in other cultures. I think this is why it's spreading more in Latin America. It's newer there, but I'm seeing a lot of interest. Over the past year, interest there is booming. And I think it's partly that too, right? I imagine you guys suffer more from some of the limits of where you currently are. Whereas, in the US, we've kind of found an okay enough way to do management hierarchy. There's not as much pain, but that also means there's not as much looking to what's next, looking for a solution to that pain. So some of the emerging world cultures are almost like leaping ahead. The same thing I'm seeing interest in now in China is starting to pop. And I look at it almost the same way as you'll see in many of those developing nations. They leapt past other technologies, like they don't use landline phones. They jumped right to cell phone technology. They skip steps. And I think Holacracy is a management technology, right? And it's the same. You can almost skip steps in that technology development if the culture is in enough need for it and it's available. So I'm seeing a surprising amount of movement in more developing countries lately.
Well, that's good to hear, especially for us, in Mexico and Latin America. Also, the health crisis has brought up, the truth about, bosses and companies overall. We've seen it a lot recently. So talking about that, and the last thing you mentioned, probably is better also for a startup or a new company to skip those steps, right? So do you get a lot of requests from new companies, and also a little bit more on how do you work? I mean, and then we can talk about other tips, for the businesses listening.
So it's much easier to adopt a new management framework before you have an existing management framework to replace, right? So startups have the easiest time with it. The only challenge there is they often don't have budget. So if they don't have somebody who already knows how to do Holacracy well, it can be harder. They often can't afford to hire a coach. So maybe they send someone to a training and then they do it themselves. But it's so much easier when you're a startup to actually put in place kind of the right management track or a more advanced management system from the beginning. It's much harder when you're changing, and then it's related to the scale. So it's easier to change a 20-person company than a 2,000-person company, right? Although we've seen Holacracy applied in larger companies. It's just a much, much more difficult transition. So the companies that are most successful at it are usually the ones that are most aware of the limits of their current framework or current habits of management, and the ones led by somebody that most deeply wants change. The founder or CEO's personal motivation seems to be the biggest predictor of success.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
it's true with most change.
Yeah, and that's how it should be, I think. Have you seen also a lot of, increased success with what you do in terms of, this new era for HR, for companies? Also because, well, in my opinion, I've seen a lot of C-level executives talking about purpose, about their own purpose, but also about the purpose of the company. I mean, do you think it has something to do with maybe the new business you're getting or this new awareness about, I don't know.
Yeah. I think even before COVID, we were already in an era of significant change to how we manage companies. Just in the recent 2 decades, we've seen a world where complexity has been increasing dramatically, right? The interconnection of the world, the globalization, the complexity of businesses, the pace of change in our environments has skyrocketed in the past 20 years. I mean, imagine running a company 50 years ago. Imagine the pace of change, the complexity. It was a radically different world. And then COVID hit a year ago. And that so if you were used to managing by micromanaging, a company, COVID made that way harder. It's much more difficult to micromanage effectively in a virtual environment. It's also much more difficult to do that effectively in times of significant change. And a lot of businesses have had to completely re-engineer themselves in the past year. So I think what was already a trend towards companies needing and looking for better ways of managing just accelerated massively in the past year, even on top of an already high acceleration. So, I mean, it's you can make up for a lot by being able to walk around an office and see people. I don't think it's a good thing. I think you should be able to be incredibly successful virtual if you have good management, right? If you have a good framework for management, and I think the best ones we know about right now are self-management frameworks that bake management into the process that everyone does. If you have a good framework, you have clarity. You know exactly what you can expect of each other. You know who does what. You know the limits of your power, which means you know your power. If you don't know the limits to your power, you don't know what freedom you have, right? So if you know all of these things, then as an individual worker, alone, virtual, you don't need to call meetings and talk to people all the time. You can just go execute, take empowered action, lead your piece, manage anyone you need to manage wherever you are in the system. And you know when you need to go to a meeting and when you don't, right? Whereas a lot of companies today use meetings for way too much. And in a virtual environment, that's way more difficult. People can't manage that way as well anymore. And so I think a lot of companies are suffering today, but ultimately I think that's a good thing. I think suffering is partly the first step towards realizing there's something better than what we're doing, and innovation is often what follows.
Definitely. Yes. And talking about that, remote leadership, how are things in the US? And I mean, you're based in Austin, where a lot of IT companies are. I even have a client there, cloud services, etc. And I mean, your industry is way more evolved with remote leadership, I think. But how are the other industries in the US? With COVID, with these new, methods, to manage people.
What's fascinating to me is how many times over the past 6 months I've talked to some business leader and had them express something like these two things together, which I find fascinating. One is COVID, cut our revenues in half, or COVID, destroyed our business. And this has been the best year of our business ever. And it's fascinating how much those two go together. And it's often what I hear from them is there was a major impact in some way from COVID. And we've stepped up our game. We've gotten more lean, more focused. We've changed strategies. We've built new capacity or whatever it is. That's not true of all businesses. Some just suffer more and others just benefit more. But so many of them have had those two together. And I'm seeing that more and more the more I talk to people lately. Almost like the first 6 months was just bad. And we had this in my business too. Our revenue cut in half instantly. The first 6 months was rough. But after that, right, all of the initiatives we put in place to adapt to it started really paying off. And we're better off now than we were before COVID. I think different businesses are in different points of that. What I see, and it is a little different per industry, right? Like restaurants are just suffering more than most, right? But others, even that's not true. I talked to a guy I know that runs a restaurant downtown in Austin, and he said, it was horrible at first, but they created all these new offerings, a new takeout kind of business, and they're thriving now. So even that is having some of that effect. But there's other factors. A lot of the tech companies, work from home is just the new normal. And that's changing cities, right? The Bay Area is dying in the US in so many ways. Austin's thriving and people are fleeing the Bay and moving en masse into Austin, Texas. Same with New York and Austin. So some cities are dying, some are booming. Some industries are just going through radical transformation. Some are better than ever. Some are maybe not admitting yet that they need to really innovate. I keep seeing delusion, like a lot of commercial real estate. I just talked to a friend of mine in that space. I said he was shocked at how many of his commercial real estate colleagues believe that this is not only temporary, but there'll be an increased demand for office space because people need more social distancing space. And so they keep putting money into commercial real estate. And I think that industry is going through a massive downsizing right now. So it's really different in different industries. But one thing that is common from every industry I talk to, there's a need for better management now. There's more turbulence, more complexity, and a need for better management.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Now, what's next for Holacracy One? And also, well, if you can tell us a little bit more, where do you have offices, clients, etc.?
Yeah, so we're virtual. We've always been virtual. That isn't a COVID thing. Our team is spread over the whole world. We have people in Central America, the US, Canada, Europe. So we've got a pretty diverse team. But even then, there was still travel involved to do our business. So one of the things that we've been doing differently now is more virtual work, which actually has been great for our purpose, right? We can reach more people because we can charge less virtually. So we were able to lower our costs some, and the effective cost to the client was much lower because travel is often cut out. There's still some services that we do in person because they make more sense to do in person if the client's in person. But we can do almost anything we do virtually now. And some of our services we do almost exclusively virtually. And we found that just works better. And we can support so many more people that way, So that's been great. And we're continuing to kind of innovate and expand in how we support clients virtually, which is, I love it in that it's using our own expertise. We've been a virtual company for 15 years. So it's kind of a natural extension of that, of how do we work with clients now who are virtual and help them manage better in a virtual environment and do our services virtually. We're doing virtual training. So we've kind of moved everything into that mode. And for us, a lot of our expansion now is how do we reach more? In the earlier parts of our business, we did big projects with a fewer number of clients. And now we're kind of shifting to how can we provide more support and a more cost-effective way to reach a much larger, diversity of companies, as well as expanding into new territories. We have partners. We have a whole licensing program where we train up management consultants in other industries who want to bring this method to their companies. So we have that whole expansion going on now in new countries where we don't speak the language. So yeah, it's just a lot of growth for us, a lot of trying to broaden our reach.
Awesome. Good. And now, do you already have a partner in Mexico or any other Latin American country?
Yeah, one of our own business partners is based in Guatemala and does a lot of coaching in that region. Another one of our business partners is in the US, but speaks Spanish and does some work in that region. We don't have any licensees doing work in that region yet, but we want some. We are looking for more consultants that want to bring this work into Central America and South America, both. That everywhere south of the US is still kind of open for us and finding partners in, which we really want, although we can support some companies ourselves, at least for now.
Definitely. Okay, perfect. Now, can you sum up again what is Holacracy, your company, and what you can achieve for companies?
Yeah, so Holacracy is a framework for self-management. So it's another way to organize a company. Instead of a top-down hierarchy of managers who theoretically we want them to create clarity and empower people within a clear structure. But in reality, we get a lot of micromanagement, a lot of poor management. Holacracy replaces that with a different way of achieving order, and it builds in more management discipline. So it builds in processes that allow anyone on a team to be involved in the management of that team. Anyone on a team can propose changes to the roles on the team, the processes on the team, and there's a discipline process for that built into Holacracy, so you get more clarity. So another way of saying it is management, better management, but without managers. Instead of a top-down command hierarchy, you have a self-management system in every team. So every team is managing itself, updating its own processes, its own roles, its own policies. What you get from it is simple, practical things like one company measured their meetings got about 90% less time to achieve the same results. So less meetings or better meetings, but then on up, more agility, more adaptability, more innovation has been measured, more creativity, and a much happier workforce because you're giving people real autonomy, real leadership, real empowerment to go drive change and be part of the purpose of the company in a much more meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Brian, again, thank you so much for your time. I think these are exciting times for Holacracy, for Holacracy One. Definitely Latin America, I truly believe is a great market for you guys because we really need companies with purpose, with better management. Sorry. And also, I think it's a great mechanism for new companies and startups, especially in Latin America, where new investments are being made. So these are exciting times, definitely. So thank you so much. And we'll be in touch. For the audience, please reach out to Brian if you have any questions or comments in terms of collaboration.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gerardo. Really a pleasure speaking with you.
You too. Nice meeting you. Take care.